Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone who is in person in Venice with us today and everyone who is joining us online. This is the beginning of the second day of the public program of the Ukrainian Pavilion. This event has the title Falling Between the Cracks, Unknown Art Histories, and it's the third of the series of 4 events which are conducted in the frame of the Ukrainian Pavilion at the 59th Venice Biennale. We started our work yesterday. We had an opening lecture by Olena Chervonik dedicated to the issue of Ukrainian art history, followed by a discussion about the problems actually and the frame of the unknown art histories in the study. And we watched a film about David Hammond's the full-length documentary about the famous African-American artist. Today, we already watched, for those who are in person, a documentary by Alexei Radinsky called Facet Color Blue about Ukrainian artist Florian Yuriev. This documentary is already a couple of years old, and last year the director released the full-length documentary which kind of follow up the events that unfolded in this short version. Unfortunately, the artist himself, Florian Yuriev, passed away last year, and actually there were other changes in this scenario and this story because of the invasion of the full-scale invasion of Russia and the Russian ties that this developer had. So, I mean, we should maybe expect the second part of the documentary unfolding the story further. This film also allows us to look at the other part of the problem of missing histories, of the so-called contested heritage, which Ukraine and other countries that were part of the Soviet Union at some point have. This contested heritage is something that's kind of falls between different variants or options, how we look at our heritage and what we want to see there. And before the full-scale invasion, in Ukraine we had this law of decommunization, which was a kind of decoloniality approach, but on the emphasis on the communist past. A huge part actually of art of the Soviet time was actually forbidden and was taken off, and it was not protected by the law. It was not considered being heritage. And many, for example, mosaics of the Soviet time, something that Olena referred to yesterday in her lecture, were just torn by the developers or just by the owners of the buildings because it was not protected as part of cultural heritage. So something like that kind of difficult or contested heritage is another way to look at how we lose something in between the cracks of narratives in art history. Today we will continue our conversation about the unknown art histories, and we will turn more into the practical side or the instruments on how we can deal with this problem, how we can solve these issues, how we can stop losing heritage and stories from art history, and how we can and what is already done in order to bring back the epistemic justice, first of all, for those who were omitted by the narrative of art history. Today's work will be following in two parts. The first will be a keynote, a lecture by Shaheen Merali. Shaheen is a writer, curator, critic, and artist of Indian heritage. He was born in Tanzania and lives in the UK at the moment. Shaheen Merali began his artistic practice in the 1980s, committing in social, political, and personal narratives. As his practice evolved, he focused more on his work as a curator, lecturer, and a critic, and has now moved into the sphere of research and writing. Previously, he was a key lecturer at Central St. Martin's School of Art, a visiting lecturer and researcher at the University of Westminster, and the head of the Department of Exhibition, Film and New Media at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin. He's a regular speaker on ideas of contemporary exhibition making internationally, and in 2018 he was the keynote speaker at the International Art Gallery at the Agahan Diamond Jubilee Arts Festival in Lisbon. Shaheen co-curated the 6th Gwangju Biennale Korea and was the co-curator of Berlin Heist of the enduring fascination of walled cities of the 4th Mediations Biennale in Poland. I would like to invite Shaheen on this stage, and the title of his keynote is Shifting Paradigms, the Role of Political Black Art and Curation in Decanonization and Decolonisation of the art field since the late 1980s. Shaheen, please welcome.
Thank you, Tetyana. Thank you for the invitation, both by the Ukraine Institute as well as the curators of the Ukraine Pavilion and their sponsors. That's a very hard act to follow, that film, which I know that most of you didn't watch, was very moving. And it partly touches on some of the things which I too will be touching on, which is, in a sense, the structures of erasure that affect one's life and life's work. But I want to start by understanding and realizing that this is our first meeting as such. So as a means of starting off, I have written the following as a form of introduction. In a sense, it's best to begin at the beginning, and how one's personal life affects one's work. I am a son of a mother who was a shopkeeper, and my father was a self-taught accountant in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. In London, my mother became a factory worker, and my father a bookkeeper for a small fashion label in Soho, London. Since the autumn of 1970, all of our lives seemed to be centered around the pain of migrating to Britain. As a young person, my life was depressed by the schoolyard violence, which was a system that made me realize some key lessons. That a lot or a great deal of my imagination and engagement with life and research has been informed by the tension and intensity of change. Admittedly, the pain I absorbed living in British localities allowed me to closely observe and making it possible to record Britain during a specific period of exploitation following its demise as a global power. This situation and what followed has helped me to answer one of the key questions raised by this forum here in Venice and by many of the pavilions for this Venice Biennale. Can we rewrite art history that is inclusive and accommodating all stories or further stories? Can we recover lost pages? I would like to begin to answer these questions as they appear in my and in the British context by quoting the British sociologist Paul Gilroy. This is where there we go. And I hate reading out the quote which is behind you, which you can read, but I think I will read it at this particular point because it's really important. Britain's nationalism and racism are routinely and symptomatically articulated together. Their differences of tone and value continue to be mediated by the undeemed power of that pivotal third term, culture, which, even when it is hotly contested, retains all the heavy and distinctive local burdens of England's peculiarities. And I'll return to England's peculiarities throughout my talk. For many who grew up in Britain in the 1970s and 1980s, it seems to be taking forever to hang up the 1980s, possibly due to the wide temporal range that revealed a great deficit and the British disconnectivity to its subjects from its former colonies. The emphasis on brutality was pronounced in every aspect of its treatment of migrants from the southern world. Even in art education, non-white students face a different set of arrangements. The Commonwealth migrant, in all its manifestation, from student to mother, from factory worker to comedian, was a grammar of not being of the white world, which acted in multiple forms of terrorizing in its chauvinist nationalism. We were expected to quietly tolerate racism, starting at the airport or on our birth. The 1980s indeed concluded more than 30 years ago, yet the decade's transformations remain active, even if the current narrative remains full of discontinuous viewing and rather understudied. The historian Nadia Kaabi-Linke was reasonably concluded recently when she suggested to conclude or to confront the very status of our beginnings, departures, and ends. The 1980s, in a sense, features a list of political crises against which we have to be revealing what are the beginnings, what are the conclusions which we have derived from them. And this list includes invasions, occupations, uprisings, forced displacement, coups, as well as surveillance tactics which emerged in the 1980s, which have become part of our realities now. And of course, the grim events of a catastrophic war between Iran and Iraq. And here, the structure and the narrative about friendship, solidarity, and loss was revealed in its most visceral way. I believe what is happening concurrently in the new millennium and more recently in Ukraine has obviously overlaps to what the Palestinian-American literary critic Edward Said stated, that between the world of ideas or images and the world of brute politics, corporate and state power and military force, strategies are formulated, values are mobilized, and expressions codified. By whom and for whom remains the question that we have to ask. How do we understand and express codifications, or the impact of new initiatives, groups, galleries, and institutions, many established by women? What might we learn from this decade? And conversely, what of its legacy should be jettisoned for the future? The rising enthusiasm brought about by reviewing the recent past in this way, the case of the 1980s, especially for the art field, as a politicized contemporary way to communicate in an expanding communication field, we can learn a lot, not only about what we have called globalization, but the impact of globalization on global phenomena. There's much to learn from modes of fighting exclusionary practices, which we did try to overcome, but I'm not quite sure if we've reached any status with it. Within this antagonism, which we call exclusionary practices, and which this forum is called, in a sense, finding a voice or looking for pages, or to a certain extent, about the complexities and concepts, where we have tried to develop aesthetics practices. the fine arts in Britain is quite an interesting model to look and search within. Many visual artists in the 1980s bridged dogmatic boundaries which were found in Britain's tradition, and they used modes such as poetry. They used community politics. Besides their own work, it wasn't basically coalescing with that, but actually finding structures within those modes of practices and of communication which were very rich. In many ways, in the 1980s, antagonism was a sensibility, a shared drama, a shared space of affection, and to provide our fleeting understanding of what was going on and going on around us as a way to express it through multiple practices, multiple spaces, and trajectories. In many ways, what happened in the 1980s became a place to remember, but also of the works spoke both of the British state and a type of Britishness, which was to an extent also amplified by the British press. So recently, there was a very interesting conference, just to sort of go slightly aside. Recently, there was a really interesting conference in Venice called A Loophole of Retreat, which some of you might have listened to some of the talks within that 3-day conference. It was a conference convened by the US artist Simon Lee, who is present here in Venice Biennale in the American Pavilion. One of the writers, or one of the sort of persons who was participating, was the writer Saidiya Hartman. And she said, and it was a really key line for me to understand what was going on in her mind around looking at the past, the recent past and the present, within the present. She suggested, we plotted to undo the worlds. And in those 3 or 4 words, there is a real intense suggestion that activism is also a form of extraction, an intense undoing, that every history, every person offers a different, possibly a different ethical issue, and from it comes out with an issue, through this issue, demands different forms to challenge entrenched forms of authority. Saidiya Hartman, in a sense, was suggesting that each articulation, each agency demands a platform also to circulate ideas. Some of them, of course, have been ignored, the platforms that artists have invented, created, performed within. And as was suggested yesterday, that a lot of power has been used by imperial practices to malign past histories or even present presentations. The French art historian and critic François Verger talked about this idea in this conference. What might we learn from testimonies that emerge from biased cultures and biased societies? Which also was the case for me in Britain in the 1980s onwards. How do we, as possibly artists, activists, exhibition makers, curators, art historians, practice responsibly, providing the results of thinking attentively? I will try to bring through the 3 examples in the second part of the talk, beginning of my understanding of the opportunities which were presented, let's say, in the 1980s. The 1980s is not necessarily a place of deep scrutinization at the moment, or nor should it be seen as a place of deep scrutinization, nor should it be seen as a form of fetishization, as the 1960s were prior to that. What it does suggest is that it provided significant moments of resistance, and they also provided a disruptive factor in a collective way, historically disruptive. The 3 instances I would like to consider here today, the first one will be the ephemeral performance by Rashida Ryan in 1977, which, no, it's all right. The ephemeral performance, or most performances are ephemeral apart from the documentation, by Rashida Ryan, called Portrait of an Artist as a Black Person. which furthermore was resituated in a notable publication called Black Phoenix, Third World Perspectives on Contemporary Art and Cultures, which only came out in 3 issues, and they were all published between 1978 and 79. So when I talk about the 1980s, literally we're talking about also the years that led to the 1980s, the beginning of 1980s. In much of the same way as events, including exhibitions, we also had, in the late 1970s and 80s in Britain, a great amount of activities devoted to trade unionism in the migrant community. There were protests from people from the ex-colonies, and these sort of collective ways of operating led to many initiatives. And yesterday we talked about the formations of archives. And one of the initiatives which I was involved in with other artists was the setting up of an organization called Panchayat, which has recently been donated to the Tate Library, and it exists alongside artist films, artist materials, ephemera. And the material that we collected since 1991 rests alongside many other materials to, in a sense, provide a library, an archive, or a special collection of hope. When one looks through the pamphlets, when one looks at the posters and invites which are present there, we are really viewing documents of courage. Here, the scarred and the scared are all in one place. Here, fear becomes memory, a site to challenge notions of bias. All of the things which I plotted out for you, in a sense, begin with the argument, which is the importance of intervention, the importance of self-motivation, as well as considering the forces of Eurocentricity. These 3 things, intervention, motivation, and realizing the forces of Eurocentricity, allows a shift to reevaluate a much broader base of identities as a source of inspiration, as evidence, culturally activated, that have, in a sense, later on empowered global protests, as we saw in May 25th, 2020, with the death of George Floyd, or the murder of George Floyd. So in the 1980s, what we did, in a sense, was called or termed as a rise of identity-based politics. Now, identity-based politics, to some extent, was the rise, in a sense, or the desire, the demand of setting up community resources, which included community bookshops, which included black art galleries. And what all of these resources were meant for was to ask through a challenging notion of by whom and for whom. In a sense, within the British cultural landscape, there was a necessity to disrupt, to create nuances, to create spaces, and to question the very fact of what was all this about, what was culture providing, and why wasn't culture providing for a broader base. Partly this was to do with the British traditions, which were informed to a large amount by its ruling of British colonies. And remember, Britain had 90 colonies, of which 16 countries were selected to become Britain's Commonwealth. Even after independence, 14 formerly known colonies became British overseas territories, and which today still remain under British rule. So to a large extent, we have traditions which have always been based on extraction, which were part of what Britain was. Now here we have the slides of Rashida Ryan's performance on the left-hand side, my left, your right, and the publication, the Black Phoenix, on one of the pages, opening pages. And to a certain extent, both of these images do. It talks about what was very peculiarly Britain, or English or England, as Paul Gilroy suggested. Thatcher, of course, was central to the 1980s for everybody concerned, whether it was a working class, whether it was women, whether it was gays, lesbian, you name it. Now, I'm going to concentrate on Rashida Ryan for a tiny bit, because I think it's important for us to realize what Jean Fisher described, the historian Jean Fisher described. When she talked about Rashida Ryan, she suggested Ryan expressed the dilemma of a first-generation diaspora, or diasporas, physically caught between the place of departure. And let's see if I can find that quote for you. No. Yeah, there's a quote. It's part of the quote. So, in many ways, let's stick to this quote, actually, because I have touched on this term black. And I think this gives you a very good idea of the political black I'm referring to. That this was a self-defining term, not based on racial types, which were given from the colonies, but a political inclusion, a political collectivity. And it was about colonial repression. So I'm going to just basically talk about, so Rashida Ryan, I think, is very important in political black art as a central figure, not only through this performance, but through the production of the Black Phoenix, as well as large amount of publications that followed throughout his life. And curating, of course, was part of his production. But what Ryan expresses throughout his life is this reality of diaspora, physically caught between the place of departure and a lost belonging in a hostile place of arrival. This dilemma, to a certain extent, is also expressed by Susan Sontag at that time when she talks about illness as a metaphor, where she suggests that we have an onerous citizenship. Everyone who is born holds dual citizenship in the kingdom of the well and the kingdom of the sick. And in a strange way, we had the kingdom of being homeland and coming back to another homeland, this idea of being in the diaspora. It is this illness of colonialism that artists carried with them in their work, facing it off. When Rashida Ryan produced his preliminary notes for a Black Manifesto, he suggested the historical factors that influence of suppressed artistic developments in the last few centuries, as well as those forces which are today predominant in the Third World. And he says, in the Third World, I mean Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Caribbean. We must also include all those non-European people whom we collectively call Black, or Black people who now live in various Western countries and find themselves in a similar predicament as that of the Third World. So that third worldness has not changed in the course of traveling abroad. And that's an important, interesting way to describe notion of third worldness and southern worldness, which we talk about nowadays. What third world or blackness or political black introduces as a subjectivity is different characteristics of alienation. Here, Ryan, and I go back to his work. Ryan, on again, my left and your right, is projecting images of minimalist work he did since his arrival in Britain, which he had to let go of this minimalist work to create works which were much more politicized. In his hand, he holds a broomstick. In a sense, what he's suggesting is the fact of the matter that that broomstick is what has been devoted to him, the person who cleans up in the West. There are symbolisms which are attached to it in his work, which confront not only the ideas of a post-minimalism to a certain extent, the minimalist grid is very absent in his work that followed this period, and then he returns to it literally 30, 40 years later. But he adapts not only symbolism of alienation, but he also talks about alienation arising in certain spaces in London. So he has photographs of himself sipping tea alone in Brick Lane. And Brick Lane in London was a place which was attacked by the National Front again and again. So the performance remains challenging in its singularity to suggest structural captivity of artists of African and Asian descent in Britain, and also a place of fast losing patience. Orion, who was a member of the British Black Panthers since 1970, grew disillusioned with the Black Panther movement, and he quit. He very much became an artist and an activist to repurpose British culture, or his part in British culture, to make props for political radical performances. In many ways, what we have to suggest, what we can suggest that the performance Portrait of an Artist as a Black Person examines the remains of the diaspora, the remains of hopes, as well as the negation of cultural heritage, which in the case of Britain is a story of migrant communities, and also part of its modern culture. Yet what remains so alluring in the production of the performance is, to a large extent, both forms of documentation that he used, as well as forms of canonization that were possible through the documentation. The performance became a contextual link and interlink both the personal and colonial narrative. In writing such statements as performances, as manifestos, in the production of essays, in the productions of magazines, including Third Text, he was a founding editor of Third Text, it became, in a sense, a template, a way that the Jamaican-born British sociologist Stuart Hall remarks, representation works through what is not shown as much as what is. So, in a sense, what we have between Rashid Orion's practice and his publications is to consider the methodology, which was adapted by a lot of practitioners, which was, alongside the artistic impulse in the 1970s and 80s, is to develop anti-racist strategies and also Black feminist thinking. The final area of how all of this establishes further into and becomes part of the culture milieu in Britain is the way that culture activists were employing also emerging technologies. This included darkrooms, editing suites in the 1980s. What enriched the community were small-run publishers who used photocopying. They were inventive with collage. They created local presses, which activated recording of the duration of, let's say, protests outside embassies, as well as outside nuclear sites. So low-skilled technologies which were available in community shops, community workshops as such, became a palpable way to, in a sense, shape interdisciplinary inquiries, both of activism, of artists' works, as well as, in a sense, enthralled a diverse intellectual community. There was a great deal of material available, but only in small amounts. And it was available in the form of small zines, for instance, small publications, small press publications, leaflets. But what this material did do for what it was at that time, it encouraged conversations about issues. It presented ideas about further talks, further performances, and eventually these conversations emerged as book fairs. And in the 1980s, there were a number of independent bookshops which appeared, which also created a credible alternative space for anti-racist ambitions as well as to consider autobiographical acts of witnessing. And I think this is kind of important because a number of the people who were who were the early publishers, the early editors, the early people, in a sense, programming these bookshops, like not only Rashid, but Darcus Howe and the artist Maud Salter, built vibrant community of artist-led small institutions which were working outside of without institutional support. In a sense, what is important is to consider the 1980s as acts where literature, artistic practices, the idea of the witness was unique. It provided a critical contribution and a reassessment of institutional colonial asymmetry. It also developed what was later to be known as post-colonial logic and a language to counteract what Britain was remissing. The formation of bookshops from the Commonwealth, about the Commonwealth, included those from Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean, which coalesced around the ideas of direct action. And they included two institutions which were really, really important at that time, which was the Commonwealth Institute and the Africa Center. The Commonwealth Institute has now become the Design Center on Kensington High Street, and the Africa Center closed and has just reopened literally within the last few months with a new venue. So there was a culture of protest, inherited also partly from post-independence restrictions, which a lot of the migrants had come from. And to a certain extent, the controversies of their past governments, the new governments and the regions, were also part of the conversation that occurred in the British institutions, which they reformed, reacted, reassembled, the small spaces where the liberal arts as such became part of the onus. And what I mean by liberal arts is that people were very interested in the notion of how to instill education, which was missing for a lot of the Commonwealth people. So there was a rise of supplementary education, Saturday schools, workshops, not only about skills, but about ideas. And all of this, in a sense, was also a challenge to the idea that was imploded onto the ex-Commonwealth migrants, that they were ethnic minorities. People were organized as ethnic minorities, but it basically was about British disconnectivity. And in various British cities, these supplementary schools, these publishing houses, these areas which looked at the entangled rights of the new immigrants through small law centers became very, very prevalent in the idea of a remodeling of Britain. And the remodeling was assessed through the idea of transformational justice. These formations of bookshops and poetry circles in major towns and cities in Britain included the New Beacon Bookshop in London and various other spaces which also came to be known as head spaces or head shops. Head shops had a very strange development. There were everything that included being a record shop, being a coffee shop, being a place to buy new books, new clothes, which came from Africa, which came from Asia, which came from the Caribbean, but not necessarily came, in a sense, from ideas of the Caribbean, the ideas of Africa, ideas of Asia as well. They supported diasporic communication. They supported what we would call language as a site of struggle, conflict as a site of struggle. Head shops, bookshops, exhibitions, supplementary schools, workshops, all became incredibly important in the settling of post-war migrants in Britain. And there were also a process addressing the lexicon of liberation struggles, both abroad, at home, and through non-aligned situations. The political black, in a sense, became a tool, an agency, a methodology for change. It also questioned colonial heritage. It basically also was confrontational to the idea of inferiority depending on one's race. In a sense, culture here became geopolitical, analytical, impassioned in tackling expressions, including the notion of beauty or the notion of pain. Political Black contributed not only to the political idea of being in Britain, but the social understanding of what it means to be in British society. And one of the legacies of political Black art is the range of aesthetic experiences it brought into British arts. So what I would like to do is to just, have we got time to show you a quick video, which is it lined up?
I think my main aim is always
Could you hold it one second?
to be...
Sorry. So this is Amrit Wilson, who was one of the first human beings, to write about the difficulty of being in Britain. She went to housing spaces which were estates, where a lot of the Bangladeshi people were dropped and who had to confront the racism on an everyday basis. She talked to the women specifically, and she concentrated on looking at women's issues as they developed in the 1970s and 80s. And in that crisis, there was a management to a certain extent, which was untranslatable to the wider community. They could not understand the diverse realities that people faced on an everyday level. And it's through her work, to a large extent in the 1970s, called Finding a Voice, that many people came to understand a new era that needed to be challenged through understanding what she was plotting for us, what she was undoing for us. So let's listen to Amit Wilson.
I think my main aim is always to fight for justice for those who are oppressed. Because I realized that I was able to write, I started writing. And I suppose in a way I became a writer. I encountered a lot of racism in Britain. And that made me realize that I needed to do something. And so I started getting more involved. And I remember once we were attacked. Well, luckily we didn't get hurt, but we were attacked. I was, taking my baby in a pushchair, and you feel very, very vulnerable in that situation. And I always focused on women, because nobody was writing about how women felt and what they had to say. The Grunwick strike was it was an amazing, it had some amazing moments, and it was also remarkable in terms of the strategies which were employed. It's the first time when Asian women were able to command that kind of power, And this was in the face of a government which was against them, a police force which was against them. There were the mass pickets, and they were remarkably inspiring. To see Arthur Scargill leading a whole sea of miners across those residential streets. It was just something unbelievable. Unfortunately, the leadership of the unions gave in and betrayed the strike. And that's why, in a way, the Grunwick strike ended in defeat. Jayaman was a remarkable woman. She was incredibly charismatic, and she had a kind of eloquence which was very much her own. So she used to go around trying to persuade women to come out, talking to their in-laws sometimes, talking to husbands, because many men and families in the Gujarati community thought that it was not respectable for a woman to go on strike. And I remember she told me at the time that, the patriarchy in the Gujarati community is very extreme. for many young Asians in this country. She was a real inspiration.
So just to end, so the fight that Amrit Wilson is talking about is within the community towards its own patriarchy, as well as the state that they were trying to fight by working to try to establish a trade union. And those fights were done in a way to were overlapped. Struggles overlapped, and paradoxically, some struggles carried on regardless of the fact that work was done. And maybe these are some of the ideas that we'll talk about throughout the next half an hour, 45 minutes, when the other speakers will be here. But I'd like to say thank you again to the Ukrainian Institute for inviting such a dialogue here in Venice Biennale. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaheen. Thank you so much. Stay with us. Pick the best seat. And we continue. We move into the discussion. Please remember all the questions you wanted to ask Shaheen about his presentation. You will have that opportunity after we finish the discussion. And I would like to invite to join us on this stage other speakers of this panel. And first, I would like to invite my colleague from the Ukrainian Institute, Anastasiia Yevseyeva, who is head of visual culture at the Ukrainian Institute. And our visual arts sector runs several programs, including the International Exhibition Support Program Visualize. Prior to joining the Institute, Anastasiia worked as a culture manager and independent curator. And in 2019, she co-curated the National Biennial for Young Art, Looks Like I'm Entering Our Garden in Kharkiv, Ukraine. I would like to mention also the co-curator of that biennial was Boris Filonenko, who is also co-curator of the National Pavilion, Ukrainian National Pavilion at the 59th Venice Biennale, the Fountain of Exhaustion. And the other speaker who is joining us in a moment is Nadia Kaabi-Linke. She's an international artist. She was born in Tunis, Tunisia, but of Ukrainian and Tunisian heritage. After growing up in Tunis, Kyiv, and Sharjah, she earned her PhD from Sorbonne University in Paris before moving to Berlin and working there. Her origins often made her feel like a stranger, and her personal history of migration greatly influenced her body of work. Nadia has won several awards, including Alexandria Biennale's Jury Prize in 2009, Abraj Group Art Prize in 2011, many other prizes. I won't take time because there are a lot. And in addition, she exhibited her work at the Centre Pompidou in Paris, Solomon Guggenheim Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, Rubin Museum in New York, and so many other museums and other biennials, and at the Venice Biennale as well. Yeah, you participated in 2011. And today, Nadia lives and works between Berlin and Kyiv, coming from Berlin at the moment, but hopefully coming back to Kyiv soon. Thank you all for joining. Our panel is titled Epistemic Justice in Art History, and I borrowed the term epistemic justice from Vitaly Chernetsky, who was part of this discussion program, of this public program in September. And here on this stage, he sat on your seat, by the way, Shaheen, and he was speaking about epistemic injustice towards those artists, cultures, countries that were colonized, that were behind the scene, let's say, of the main narrative of art history, and those who were underrepresented, overlooked, fallen between the cracks for centuries. So while thinking about this part of the program, talking about art history and a way to look at art history as an inclusive process. I remembered that term and I decided to borrow this term from Vitaly and to put it as the epistemic justice, which I believe is possible. Hopefully, we'll talk about that. Before we actually dive into the discussion, I would like to ask Nadia and Anastasiia to present yourself, your practices, your backgrounds deeper so that the audience understands and is aware, and maybe also suggest some cases that we can refer to in our conversation. So could you please, Nadia, start? If you need the...
Hello? Yes, it's working. This is for the presentation later. Yeah. So thank you very much, Tanya, for the great presentation. I'm sorry that I was a bit late. While you were presenting me, I heard that you were speaking about my background with different cultures. Probably this is a moment that I can speak about it more in detail, because it is in relation to all of the discussion about oblivion, erasure, and so my two main backgrounds is Tunisia and Ukraine, as my dad comes from Tunisia and my mom from Ukraine, and I have been living now for several years in Germany, so it's also part of my culture, because my kids are German, and yeah. And interestingly enough, Tunisia is recognized, is in the main history of all the books, as a country that has been colonized. So it is a southern country in Africa, colonized from a northern European country, very classical case, so there's nothing to discuss here. I also experienced that other, more insidious, more hidden kind of colonialism, where you're completely confused, and I can speak about my own experience. So I grew up in Tunisia with a very Slav and Russian-speaking community, where it was Soviet Union when I was a little kid, and we didn't make so much difference between Ukraine, Belarus, Russia. It was all one, especially in the diaspora, people get closer. So my first language was Russian. And as you know, with the language, also a lot of culture is given through. So we were made to believe that there is no real difference. And what we thought for a long time is innocent, actually now we realize what that means. It's even like the case of Tunisia, everything was clear. The enemy was there, he looked different, he had a different religion, and he came from a different continent. In the case of Ukraine, it's like you're made to believe that you are the other. And that's why it is so difficult, I think, to place the culture, the country, all its clear struggle also on the books of the universal books. And I feel it like almost in my skin, because I grew up in these two opposite realms. We're speaking about colonialism, but the one is accepted, because there's especially, we were speaking about racism, but here I will speak on the other side of the racism. It is also racist not to consider the Russian or the Soviet and the Russian Empire colonialism as colonial power. It's not because we are Europeans and we have the same religion that we were not under terrible oppression. And I see here a parallel, by the way, with Ireland. Also is not so much like in the books like what we would think of the global south, the term that we use today of the global south. So it is really complex, because it's very easy to, I understand everything what was in the kind of oppression and slavery history and everything what Africa has endured, and I am part of it. But the other part of history is unfolding now, unfortunately, with terrible pretext of the war. But this is like the opportunity to really once and for all put the final point on the E. So this about my background. And we chose together to speak about an artwork. Actually, it is an exhibition, which the title is Blindstrom in German, and it means ideal current. It was supposed to open at the National Art Museum in Kyiv in March 4th. It's an exhibition that we have been working on since 2018, and unfortunately didn't open, of course, because of the full-scale invasion. But we're still working on the project, and we see many possible perspectives for it. And we chose to speak about it because in this exhibition there's one main project which is called Blindstrom, which speaks about these erased histories and about oblivion through the collection of the museum. But it is a very specific collection. It's called Spetsfond, so from the word special. And unfortunately, it reminds us again of the special operation, because Putin doesn't really call the war yet as war, but special. So everything what's special has like this kind of destruction and erasure effect. So yes, it's a collection that was made during the Stalinist repression era, and it started approximately at the end of the 1920s, and continued until late 60s. And I mean, some works were revealed for the first time in the 1990s after the independence of Ukraine. So probably we can start. Just the first one, yeah. So what we see here is the poster. Yeah, great. What we see here is the poster of the exhibition that didn't open yet. And so probably I want to say 2 words where the inspiration of the project came from. The first moment was when I spoke with the curator of the museum, Oksana Bershinova, and she was telling me about the collection of the museum, and I realized that there was something very special about this collection, which is not usual to what I know from other museums. It's that the history of every object, of every artifact, tells somehow or narrates the history of the country. Usually when we have artworks in museums, we are interested about what the work represents. But in this case, it was very interesting to know the destiny of each work, in which condition it was produced, when was it hidden, who looted it, when did it come back. And then I realized that actually the collection is narrating the modern history, I'm starting from the end of the Russian Empire, until today. So that was like really aha moment for me. And then a second moment was when I went in 2018, I met the artist Lada Nakaniechna. She was doing at the time a research about the history of the Academy of Arts in Kyiv. And we were speaking with her and her husband, who's also a teacher, their professor. And they were telling me that the mentality of the academy didn't change much since the Soviet Union. And we're speaking here 2018, so like there was already the Maidan, the Orange and the Maidan revolution and everything what we know politically, on the political and the cultural scene that changed in Ukraine. And yet, the professors, most of the professors, not all of them, were still like keepers of a legacy that most of the people, especially the youth, don't want to have. So there were no real programs of exchange between other museums in Europe or Western countries. They were not able to like express contemporary art visions and forms. So that was like also another moment, that misunderstanding, but also that brought a kind of frustration and anger even, because if you see the history of the academy, it's not innocent. Because this same mentality of the social realism is the one that was responsible for the assassination and the erasure of the Ukrainian avant-garde and the Bagamazov and Boychuk movement and all of what we know of very precious and important heritage, world heritage, I would say. So that was like another moment for me. And the idea was, I'm sorry if I'm taking, you tell me if I'm too long. It's a bit complex to make it short in 2 words. So the idea was basically to go back to the Spetsfond and to take works, existing artworks, from known or unknown artists, and to treat them really like individuals. Like, of course, we're interested about what is represented, but mostly we're interested about the fate and the history of every work. So in this case, the back of the painting is as important as the frontal, because on the back of the painting of the stretchers, you have several numbers of different collections where the work went, and some writings that were very important indicators for us to retrace this archival history. So I worked with a local historian who did an amazing job. So later with the slides we will be going, I selected some works that we're gonna get into detail in. So this was the first thing, the historical background. The second element that was most important to me was really, the choice of the works was, the more they were damaged, the more it was interesting for me. Because most of these works are damaged, and they are damaged because they were supposed to be destroyed, so they were mishandled. Some of them were really, like, you can see, there was a voluntarily will to erase what is on the painting. Some others, they have like a kind of erasure of the faces, and I will be going to cases to explain how the censorship was systematic and how it came about. And so like the traces of the destruction, or let's say the pain that you can see on the surface of the canvas, for me, the idea of the project is that somehow it mirrors the pain of a collective population, of people, of nation. And there is another important moment. I wanted to include the, how do you say this? The people who cannot really see. So visually disabled. There's another term. Visually impaired people. Because this is another theme that has been always very dear to me. There is little, if at all, space for visually impaired people in museums. But if people don't see well or don't see, doesn't mean that they cannot perceive. And this way of perception is very precious for us who see, to have this kind of exchange. So I wanted them to be not only invited in the project, but I wanted the core project to be around them. So it wouldn't be possible without them. This is why I took them, I thought to work with them very intimately, and they would be the mediators. So they would be the one telling the blinded history, the censored history of, so there is this poetical moment of bringing them, and also through their own presence, we speak about this blinding of our collective history. But there is also another reference that I discovered recently, I didn't know about. I don't know if you know the instrument bandura. It's a traditional Ukrainian instrument, but it is also a very political instrument of resistance, because it used to be a lot of people who played with the bandura, they were blind, and they were called kopsars, and they used to sing stories around the resistance and the fights of the Cossacks. And a lot of local, it's a very local tradition, and every region has its own songs and its own bandura kind of playing everything. And so these Koptsars were oppressed, and it was forbidden for them to play during the beginning of the 19th century and before, from the Russian Empire. Some of them became beggars, etc. So this reference about telling the history, the unwanted history, and the erasure with the blindness is already present in the Ukrainian history and way of storytelling and identification. So there was this other moment. So the exhibition, basically, this one work, the main work, which is a performance installation, you would have a selection of works from the collection that are hanging, and under each work that has damages like the piece that we see here, there will be an equivalent, but it is a tactile kind of painting. So everyone would be invited to touch, and I represented millimeter per millimeter every damage that is on the canvas. It is reproduced like a relief, so coming out, with the same technique that is used in the museums to give the people who cannot see, like the disabled people, they have usually small surfaces that they can touch so that they can identify with the work that they are seeing. But in this case, I'm placing the spectator in the same perspective. So everyone perceives the work in the same way, whether you see or you don't see. This is basically the very main idea of the project. And now we can go, it's here. Here? Okay. So, is it the first? Yeah. So this is one, this painting is of Yefim Shevtsov. And this painting, from our researches, it came out that it was never shown yet in no exhibition at all, because there was also an exhibition that was realized in the museum called Spetsfond, curated by Yulia Litvinets. Amazing work, really made research about this particular theme, but some of the works were not also shown in this exhibition, so this is one of them. And so what we see here, it's 8 political figures. Now, first of all, Yefim Shiptsov, he was known for doing commissions for political, like commands from the commissions from the government. So we see here 8 figures, and 4 of them are erased. We were not able to identify everyone. But we were able to identify 2. So on the extreme right, we see Yevgeny Veger, and he was one of the important figures. He was one of the first secretary of the Communist Committee in Odessa. And the second one is Nikolai Popov, and he was the secretary of the Central Communist Party. So both of these faces we were able to recognize because of the erasure was not that perfect. They were arrested and executed in 1937, and the work was realized also in 1937. And we think that this piece entered the Spetsfond in the same year because we can see that the portrait of Stanislav Kassior is still there. And it's not erased, but this person was already arrested in 1938. So by doing a very precise archival research, we were able to know approximately when the painting was realized and when it went to the Spetsfond. This is a typical case of erasure. So even if the theme was very much wanted and commissioned and was really the case, if the people that are represented became persona non grata, which was something very current at the Stalinistic era, the whole work went to the Spetsfond. This one, okay. And here, yeah. So this is one of the very known pictures of Lenin speaking in front of the Bolshoi Theater. And we can see the figure of Trotsky, and in the next, I'm sorry, maybe, yeah, you see it's already erased. And then this picture served as a basis for a very important propaganda image, a painting represented by Isaac Brodsky, of whom we're going to see later a painting. But the awkward thing, what seemed to me here, is how the first painting, Harvest, that we saw before, how the same technique of erasure was used for painting. And as an artist, I was wondering, like the person who's doing the censorship, do they think that there is still a kind of artistical content that you can still show the painting, or why they just wiped off the face? It was like a very weird historical, aesthetical moment of understanding, because on the level of the photography you can understand, you erase completely from the film the negative, but on the painting, so it's like really such a totalitarian way of just erasure. We can continue. So this one is a very known painting of Vasil Sedlar, and you see the painting, it is not destroyed because it is a representation of a postcard that was printed in 1929 from the publishing house Ukrainian Worker, and they published at that time 15,000 postcards. Can you continue, please? Yes. So this is how the painting is today. It is mostly damaged. I spoke with the restorer, and there are assumptions that it was like deliberately, there was kind of a liquid, chemical liquid, poured on the painting so that you can really erase the figures. Of course, there are the traces of folding, etc. But 2 words about the context of this work. So the work is called Shooting, and we are assisting, if you can go back, so what we can see, back, yeah. So we are assisting at one of the crimes, war crimes during the civil war of the Russian Empire, former Russian Empire. So we see Russian soldiers executing supposedly Ukrainian peasants who have collaborated with the Soviet government. And later we know that this painting was actually shown in Kharkiv, Kyiv, Dnipro, in Luhansk, Makiivka, in many places. But it was even shown in 1913 to 17th Venice Biennale. And, but in 1937 there was already strong criticism against the Bolshevik movements. And so this painting entered the Spetsfond a few years later. And it was heavily damaged from 37 till 1965. What we know is that Vasily Sedlar was executed. He was shot, killed, accused of conspiration, enemy of the people, like most of the artists, avant-garde artists of the time, unfortunately. He was rehabilitated, though, in 1958, but his work was really shown only after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1990. So this is just one of the examples how the hidden history with the damages tells something about our time. You can continue, please. So what I did here, the next one, is really to retrace all of the damages. Here you see how I did one-to-one, and the next one. So this would be what the people will not see because it's black on black and you can only touch the traces of the damages. But this is how I worked in order to reproduce. So all the kind of damages are present on the replica, which is a tactile replica. So this is the painting of Isaac Brodsky that I was talking. Why I selected it? It's many works. I'm not going to show everything, but every piece had I wanted to share a specific story because Isaac Brodsky was the star of the social realism, and he was considered as the official artist of the Soviet Union, and he was even influential in changing the Academy of Art in Kyiv, because he came from Leningrad to work with the director at that time, and really he has put for himself, his enemies were not only Ukrainian, but avant-garde in general. And yet, this person had his work disappear in the Spetsfond. And also, what is interesting is that this painting particularly, you don't find it in any of his biography or monography. It's completely disappeared and wiped off. Why? Because he represented Alexei Rykov, who was a very important and elite person from the society. He was a minister at that time, but in 1936, after an intestine internal, like a kind of war within the party, he was dismissed of his function, and it went until even his shooting, his killing in 1938. So we see his face is completely wiped out, but everything, any history, any story, any writing related to this person is erased as if he was never born. So this is was a systematic way of dealing with something that you don't like. We can go there. Yeah, so another so this is actually the painting that was on the poster, so reproduced the damages, and approximately that would be the tactile. So the next painting is from Irina Beklemesheva, Rise of the Workers. And why I chose this piece in particular, you see, most of this is also something important to notice. Most of the works, they are more than politically correct. They are corresponding to, thematically, of course not artistically, thematically, to something that would be accepted by the society of that time. So you see here the rise of the workers against the capitalist, brutalist oppression. But I chose this painting in particular because if you continue, Tanya, to the next one, you can see that in the damages, there was a long line in the middle, and that long line is because there were two canvases that were stitched together. So this is also the interesting thing. When you go so close to the materiality of the painting, you really understand something about the artist, but also about that time. Artists were very poor, most of them at that time, so they were not able to afford one canvas, one big canvas, and it was current that they would take several canvases, paint also on both sides. Several paintings have also both sides painted, and stitch them together. And so while we made researches about this artist, also we know that we really asked the Academy of Art to exonerate her from the fees that she was not able to afford. And she was also a very close friend of Oksana Pavlenko. They exchanged a lot of letters together. And Oksana Pavlenko, she's also one of the artists who has a work in our exhibition. I find it fascinating, the works that she did with on the magazines, on journals, because she also didn't have money to buy paper. And later, this attitude of using the materials that are around you brought up what we know as collage, compositions, working with different. So she became one of these very important and known avant-garde artists, but it was like this movement of freedom. It's not because I don't have with what to work that I'm going to stop. On the contrary, it's going to be a creative reason to produce something completely out of the box. We can go to the next one. And so this one I love also. I mean, I love them all. But this is Katerina Borodina, and it's called In the Village Council. She's one of the known Bolshevist artists. She died, unfortunately, also very early. She lived extremely poorly and of disease. And also here, again, it's a theme that's actually should be accepted, but done in a very Boychuk style, monumental style. So Boychuk and Lev Kamarenko were her teachers. And so this work was very early forbidden. It was shown in, I think, 1934, and in the same year she was attacked by Soviet critics, and her work entered the Spetsfond in 1939, and it was first shown in 1990. So we're speaking about 70 years of oblivion here. And I think we'll do the last one, the next one, and there are more, but this is, again, so my process, how I produce the tactile equivalence. So Hrihori Khizhniak, Tripilia Tragedy. So as you can see, it's quite a realistic painting of a theme that is more than glorified in the Soviet time. It was used really by the Soviet propaganda. And this is because there was a historical moment. So in summer 1990, there was a troop of young Komsomol from the Red Army who were supposed to attack a colony in Tripil, in the region of Tripilia. And instead what happened is that the hetman, Danilo Tripil, encircled them and killed most of them. So they're presented like these innocent, combative, socialist, communist fighters and the martyrs. So this an event became very important, represented in the poetry, in different paintings, etc. And yet this painting is also repressed and went to the Spetsfond. And actually, I forgot to say in the beginning, there were two main reasons why works would be repressed. The first one is the so-called formalism, which at that time meant avant-garde. Everything was not socio-realism. And the second reason is because of the artist maybe had political activities or became disgraced, or for any political reasons, actually. Yeah, so these are there's Lev Kramarenko later, but you can show the painting. So these are, yeah. And this is one of the works of Lev Kramarenko. It's actually triptych. This is a monumental painting. And it has been restored. So there are few works that have been restored and have no damages, but only because they're restored, of course. Yeah. Yeah, that was the last one, yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nadia. And I know that the project actually had another part, which was the video, the video work, but maybe, yeah, maybe you can later explain like how it worked all together.
Yeah, I can say 2 words because this is only one part. So the exhibition is planned with 3 major works. They're all actually quite monumental. So this one is a performance installation, and there is an installation working with the space of the museum. And so it's a space where you enter and you suddenly don't have a floor anymore. So you're really like in a hovering state, and you don't know where's your right, your left. I didn't use mirrors. The first idea would be that there are mirrors, but there aren't. And actually it's very crazy because I thought of it like 3 years before the war, but now that I look at it, it really makes the situation of it. Slowly, I feel like we're coming out of it and we're feeling our feet, and strong belief that things will go for the best and that we will win. But in the beginning, it was like, this was like my feeling after the first weeks of invasions, complete loss of direction. And the third work is a video installation, which actually is very biographical, because it's my mom talking, and she's talking from the moment where she met my father and all her bureaucratical nightmares. It's just one, it's all a Sovietic labyrinth of bureaucracy that make to explain why today I cannot have my Ukrainian citizenship because of one word missing and a document that Russia today doesn't want to give us back, things like that. But so anyways, through, again, like the works, through the history of one person, if you extracted that it's my mom, you can also understand the whole part of modern history of Ukraine. And the piece is called Squeezed in Infinity, and I created also a space of complete disorientation. You don't know, you just know that it's infinite, but also you're squeezed in it. And hearing the stories you really like, you don't know how to get out of it.
Thank you so much. Well, I really hope that we will be able to see this exhibition
We will.
not only somewhere, but in Kyiv, the National Museum, where it was actually supposed to be. Thank you. And Nastya, would you please give your talk?
Yeah, thank you. I would like to start my presentation with a short historical example. In 1910, French critic Guillaume Apollinaire praises the works of artistic group called Rénovation Byzantine, which were presented during the Salon of the Independence in Paris. And this group was established by a Ukrainian artist, Mikhailo Boychuk, who comes to Paris in 1907 after his studying in Lviv, Krakow, and Munich. Boychuk, together with his students, was trying to reinvent Ukrainian art on the basis of the best achievements of Byzantine and Kievan Rus art. In 1917, after the regaining of the independence of Ukrainian state, Boychuk and many of his students returned to Ukraine with the aim and the idea of establishing the new Ukrainian art. After the occupation of Ukraine by the Bolsheviks, the first short period of colonization policy gives Boychuk an opportunity to continue his artistic practice, but as the regime strengthens, his art becomes more and more conservative, and due to this increasing pressure by the Soviet regime. And instead of creating the national style, his monumental art becomes to serve the purposes of propaganda. And we can have a few slides to show the first artworks. This is Mikhailo Boychuk's and his students, the next one, his students' artworks during the beginning of his activity. And then we can see their artistic practice during the Soviet regime. No, that will be the last one. The attempt to compromise with the regime ended up tragically, and ideologically the works of Boychukists, how they call themselves, and we are now often referred to the group like the Boychukists, they were too pro-Western, too independent, too formalist, and the Soviet regime saw a big danger in that, and therefore in 1936 Boychuk was accused of espionage, and in 1937 he was shot together with his wife Sofia Nalapinska-Boychuk and most talented and prominent students to whom my colleagues had already referred. Vasil Sadler, Ivan Padalka, Ivan Lipkivsky, and not only Boychukists had this fate, but as well there was a whole generation to whom we now refer as to the executed Renaissance, and it was the founder of Ukrainian futurism, Mikhail Semenko, the innovator of performative art and establisher of philosophical theater, Berezil, Les Kurbas, Yuri Klan, Mykola Zerov, and many others, poets, writers, and cultural figures who were completely erased from the art history for a long time. And the gaps in the artistic history were filled by the Soviet art criticism, by the talks about realism as the only embodiment for the needs of the proletariat. Almost all of the monumental art by Bolshevikists was destroyed, and as well as many of the artworks by his students. Boychuk's legacy largely survived due to an attempt of another artist, Yaroslava Muzika, a Lviv-based artist and civil activist. Yaroslava herself was accused to 25 years of sentence in the prison in Siberia. And while she was serving her sentence, her husband, Maxim Muzika, a well-known microbiologist, risked his life and saved some of the works that Yaroslava had by Boychuk and his students in their apartment he shared with his wife. He kept the collection in a small niche between the doors, between their apartment and the apartment of Yaroslava's sister, Hanna Stefanovich. And after Yaroslava returned from Siberia, she continued to preserve the collection under the risk of her life. And now these works are saved and they have been donated to the National Museum in Lviv in the 60s, when it was more safer to talk about Bolshevikists. The destruction of this artist is connected not with this danger from the concrete person as personality, but the regime was afraid of the Ukrainian art as such. And this can be confirmed by the fact that all of the artworks by Bolshevikists that could be found by the regime were destroyed. The erasure of this art was not limited just by but by the physical destruction of the artist and the destruction of the creative class. It went beyond the borders of Soviet Union by erasing these names from the world art history. Lately, last year, we were designing a program for Polish artists together with our partners from the Polish from the Adam Mickiewicz Institute and the Center for Contemporary Art, Ujazdowski Castle, and we were looking for a name for it, and it was natural for us to come up with the name of Mikhailo Boychuk's wife, Sofia Nalepinska-Boychuk, an artist of Polish origin. She actually comes from an aristocratic Polish family, which is well known in Poland and who assimilated to Ukraine and contributed a lot to Ukrainian art. And it was interesting that our Polish colleagues who are experts in art have never heard about her. Although they know about her Polish family and they were aware about Mikhailo Boychuk's artistic practice. So returning these forgotten names is one of our aims as an activity, especially the names of female artists. It was important for us to reclaim these once silenced voices, and it has always been in the core of our activities. The team of Ukrainian Institute is currently working on the process of reappropriation and decolonization of Ukrainian art. We are constantly communicating with international institutions, with museums, arranging public discussions and events like this one, and gathered a group of art historians to help us properly appropriate names affiliated to Ukraine. We have started researching online collections of big museum institutions in search of names affiliated to Ukraine. And I have to say that we have many insights and even more questions upon this way. We found many inaccuracies in biographies of artists that are connected to Ukraine, and I'm sure this can also refer to other countries with imperial heritage. Partly this can be caused by the lack of professionals on Ukrainian art abroad, but as well the influence of post-imperial approach to well-known figures like Kazimir Malevich or Alexander Ekster. To our opinion, it is important to reconsider this approach to these well-known figures, as well as terms like Russian avant-garde. One of the most common problems that we faced is identifying the place of birth and artistic practice of the artists, we oftenly found that it is referred to Russia instead of Russian Empire, or Austria instead of Austro-Hungarian Empire, when actually referring to the territory of Ukraine. And one more problem is the transliteration and proper spelling of the names, because usually the Russian way of spelling names instead of the Ukrainian is used. The last couple of decades can be characterized by the attempts of the museum institutions to rethink their decolonial policies, and it is important for us that Ukraine is also included in this process. In discussions about decolonialism, we oftenly hear that it refers to Western Europe or US as the main colonizers of previous centuries, but Russian colonial policy is obvious, and it continues to influence political, social, and cultural life of Ukraine and other neighboring countries. And it is worth mentioning that Russian Empire was forbidding the very existence of Ukraine, and even the name of the they would not let to have the administrative unit under the name of Ukraine to exist during the Russian Empire. They also forbid Ukrainian language, and although they kind of tried to say that it does not exist and rather referred to it as to the Little Russia dialect. Our aim is not only to return these once silenced names to art history, but also to find proper language in referring to names that are affiliated to Ukraine, but are often considered as Russian artists. Figures like Alexandra Exter can also be an example of imperialist approach to art history. Alexandra Exter was born in Białystok, which is now in Poland, and out of 67 years of her life, she spent 35 in Ukraine, mainly in Kyiv, and only 4 in Moscow. And she is a very prominent figure in establishing Ukrainian art in 20th century. So our aim is not just to change this wording and appropriation of Russian to Ukrainian, but to acknowledge a wider spectrum of identities of artists, as well as to develop a framework which would help us properly appropriate the names with multinational identities. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nastya. Thank you, Nadia, Shaheen. I don't know if you wanted to add anything, or we can just move into the discussion.
I think what's been really interesting is the notion of what is true in some contexts is false in another. And what does it take, to a certain extent, to move away from a kind of a standardization which creates truth and falsity or falsification. And I think it's very interesting to bring this idea of the epistemic injustice and into this as a kind of a method of how knowledge is a process of exclusion, of silencing, of time and barrier, distortion, misrepresentation, undervaluing. All of these things are part of what is part of the arts. It's very interesting that when Nadia was talking, another term came up which Victor Bergin talked about. It's called privileging the ocular. And this idea that the arts is about the eye, which came up so much yesterday in the notion of the blind spot that Olha Zuk talked about. And I think there is, in contemporary art, a move away from privileging the ocular, a deliberate move to contravene what has happened to the arts. The history of the arts has been attempts to silence, to standardize. And in a sense, for instance, we say that person is tall. What is the standard of being tall? Yeah? literally, where do you get the idea that this is tall and this is short? And we take it for granted that it's based on some specific racial type. So I was very tall in Mexico, but I'm not tall in Europe. So where does that leave the idea of a specific idea of measure? Now, the other thing that was also interesting to what Nadia was saying, that there were two pieces of work which I had curated. One was a very large piece of work by Zhang Dali, a Chinese artist based in Beijing. He called it Second History. And he went through recovering all attempts which were made by the Mao chairmanship, if we can call it that, of exactly the same protest that you were talking about, where people would just disappear from images. He traced those images to the original photograph and replaced them and created a second history after the disappearance of the subjects. Again, there was a very interesting work in the Mercosur Biennale where photographs, which were from Chile, had literally people cut out of these portraits because they contravened some sort of family dispute. So the image of that person would literally be cut out, and it still exists as a photograph of the family because they contravened some standardization of values. So I think it's really interesting, important to talk about how something becomes a strong epistemic position, who creates that strength for that episteme to a certain extent, and what are the possibilities to get away from the idea, oh, this must be, or this may be, or this probably is. These are the quantifiers, in a sense, which I use to then justify. This is Russian, this is Soviet, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. And I think these are the important things which you need to get away from. And how do we, what are the methodologies available now that we know that this is the problem? What do we do about it? We can recite and talk about all of the things. We can look at this as evidence, post-evidence, and non-evidence. But then what? That's the decisive moment we're at. And of course, we can remain skeptical all the time. We can make works about skeptics. But where does that take us? And that's the value of this particular time, which is so important.
Thank you. From the conversations yesterday and today, I see kind of 2 or 3 timelines that we refer to constantly. One is the Ukrainian 20s, something that's called the executed Renaissance, where the Boychuk actually also fall to. And Olena mentioned this yesterday, but it's also important to remind that exactly on these days in 1930s, hundreds of artists in Ukraine were executed. So literally the whole generation. I mean, it's really hard to imagine for us, but imagine like all the artists participating in the Venice Biennial, which is like a few hundred, just executed in a few days. Can you imagine this blind spot, like how huge this blind spot is? Like these people will never do another biennial, will never teach anyone, will never do any work, maybe will not create their most important work. This is what happened in Ukrainian art history, where we actually lost the whole artistic generation, and we had to begin from the scratch somewhere in the 60s. And this is like the second timeline that we refer to. And Olena's lecture yesterday referred to this history of Ukrainian art that was created in the 60s, which can be also kind of seen and observed as part of this 60s movement, which was a dissident movement at the same time. And many artists who were working as artists and were kind of, doing official work for the artist union were also part of the dissident movement. And this, actually, it's very important. I would like to stress that after decades of the oblivion of the Bolshevikists, who were literally physically executed together with all their with the archives, everything, and even memory was forbidden, even in their own families. it was the art history of Ukraine that was produced in the 60s that actually returned back this name from the oblivion. And it was actually this person who was able to survive being in prison for decades, who then could bring back that history again and put it in the narrative of art history of Ukraine. So this rewriting of art history in Ukraine already happened, and we could see it even under the Soviet oppression, even under all those limitations. People were daring, they had the bravery, they had the courage to do so, even knowing how harmful it can be. They could be sentenced again, and they could be killed. But nevertheless, they risk to bring back their peers, their colleagues that were buried somewhere in mass graves beyond Kyiv or somewhere in Sandarmokh, far in the Russian north. And that courage allowed to rewrite history in a very endangered situation. And that allows us to know this history now and bring even more names out of the shadow, out of the oblivion. So we are kind of looking from today's lens to the situation 100 years ago and to the situation 60, 70 years ago, and how that situation 60 years ago allowed the situation today to happen. So that was kind of a bridge that brought together these different parts of history that were meant to be separated. So we were meant to forget everything that happened 100 years ago. But thanks to that bridge in the 60s, thanks to this art history of Ukraine in 6 volumes, we now have the foundation, we have the floor to stand on, and to kind of look and walk straight forward to rewrite our history again and to get even more emancipation from that colonial power and the imperial power, and that occupying power that was always kind of oppressing and not allowing us to be what we are. So my thought at the moment is that even from those examples that we have from both Ukrainian culture and the Black culture in the UK, I see how much progress we have done and how much situation has changed even in 60 years, even in our lifetime. And I'm being optimistic. I see the strategies, I see the instruments, how this can be done, how these stories can be rewritten, how this blind spot can be filled in, how the names can be brought again, even the burned archives can be returned somehow. I don't know, reconstructed somehow.
Artists are here.
Artists are here to do that, yeah. So my first question to you would be, how do you see actually the instrumentarium, the methodology of bringing back this past, from actually what we have already mentioned and what has still to come, from all of your different perspectives, from artistic perspective, from curatorial perspective, from institutional perspective, So you gave us a few cases from your practices, but maybe you would like to share more about how this can be done, what still can be done, what still has to be done in order to kind of narrow this blind spot, make it smaller, and bring more light into this shadowed part.
I will speak as an artist. So for me, it's not the work to bring the reality as such, the histories that are lost, and say this is truth. First of all, truth is something that we can really discuss. Shaheen said it beautifully about knowledge. Knowledge is about wiping out and everything. So it will always be still a matter of interpretation. But I think what art can do is bring situations, put people or the spectator in a certain situation of reminiscence, of remembering. Even if you don't have the real information, you can open your heart in a certain way that you can feel almost what has happened. And what, especially if we're speaking about the case of Ukraine and Ukrainians, even if you don't have the names, but if you put them in certain situations, the spectators, knowing what is happening today. For me, by the way, the difference between past, present, and future is still an illusion, like something that I always work in my work. So there is always a piece of past in the present and the future is already in the past because we project ourselves. So it's like one continuity. But I think what art can do is really open the space of the unknown, of the non-understandable, but yet something about the perception, always in relation to the history, of course. And this is something that, like what we showed before with Blindstrom, is an example of a particular case, but I have been always working somehow like that. Yeah.
I can add, as a representative of an institution, that I see a big role of institutions in this process, especially museum institutions, because museums had, the role of the museum changed a lot from just preserving and exhibiting art to being the place of dialogue and rethinking and questioning. And I think that museums have to be ready to hear different points of view and to take them into account during providing their policies, to acknowledge them, and to be ready to for a dialogue with different opinions. And in this way, the institution, if it's not being closed in its own bubble, but is open to the society and to other points of view, will have this chance for a constant research and development, and then could be more inclusive in terms of these silenced art histories.
I was very glad yesterday to hear Olina Chernovich, who is here in the audience actually. She said two things which really, really stuck with me. She talked about political dexterity. Then she also talked about the idea of self-specificity. Now, both of those things, when she recounted the history of writing those books, of the idea of working even in a different department of architecture and not of art because it was disallowed. That was a dexterity which is necessary now. The self-specificity is all around here. The amount of knowledge, even within yesterday's and today's presentation, is absolutely new for the rest of the world. This is something that you all know and are holding on to and are recounting. So that distortion that has been in place for such a long time is being now reevaluated. And what you're doing to a certain extent is applying it to a different way of acknowledging realities. And I think, for instance, yesterday, just for a little while, in that David Hammond's film that was screened here, it said, blah, blah, blah's heaven is blah, blah, blah's hell. And I won't mention who that blah, blah, blah is, because you can just put anything you want in there and it will make sense. So that ascription, that kind of ordering of somebody's heaven and somebody's hell, is when there is a miscommunication or we haven't been able to talk about something. And something else that David Hammond said, which I've written down here, which I'll just get it. His words were, and he said, we need new forms of communication for those who could not talk to each other. And David Hammond's is so important in this particular moment because he also said, the other thing he said, I'm an artist, but I'm not of this art world. And taking that position is the only way, to a certain extent, in a sense, to present evidence. Present not only that skeptical, but the discomfort others find from taking that position. If anything, decoloniality is a long process. It's a process about due respect. It is a process about dignifying and dignity. And when you have suppressed something, how do you present dignity to it now? How do you produce dignity? And the possibility to re-exist and to mourn for something is there. But the memory can allow you to work with the material, can give you a place to some extent to complete and move away from the violence. Because the violence is a completeness in a sense, or is incomplete even to some extent because it's ongoing. There are new forms of violence that come up all the time. So the work that you're doing now at the Institute could be wiped out quite easily by something else which is introduced into the system. Yeah? So how do you carry on working with that work of memory, of suppression? How do you dignify something so it doesn't fall off grace? Those are sort of things that we are dealing with at this particular moment. And it's not only Ukraine. This is going on in Tibet. This is going on in Palestine. It's going on in Yemen. It's going on in Kashmir and in Iran at this particular moment.
Your speech just reminded me that in one of the previous conversations also held on this stage, we spoke with our Ukrainian colleagues that actual decoloniality of Ukraine started in 2014, and it started on Maidan in Kyiv, and the event is called the Revolution of Dignity. And that word dignity that you referred to is a reference to that page of our history. I think that in that sense, decoloniality, art, and politics meet, and the meeting point is this return of dignity to someone from whom this dignity was taken away for centuries, and for the people that didn't even know that they were supposed to have it. Yeah. So how can you return this dignity to the nation, to the culture, to the people? The name of this conversation, the epistemic justice, refers to a certain system, the epistemic system, a system of knowledge. And in this system of knowledge, actually, that was shaped by the Western world and is, as we know, centering around the history of Western world and art history of the Western world. Do you think that epistemic justice to everyone, the inclusive epistemic justice, would mean the change of this system, the epistemic system in such? I mean, the system of knowledge, getting knowledge, how art history is taught, how art history is spread and delivered as the sphere of knowledge. How do you think this sphere should be changed, if needed?
The term epistemic justice actually comes from the feminist activism, and one of the common ideas of the feminists, well, it exists, that to secure total for the rights of every gender and every person to be equally preserved, we need to change this persistence of the world, the system that is, where male gender is dominating, and it kind of refers to your question, Tetyana, about do we have to change the system, which is pro-Western, to include all the other stories in it. And I would be radical in that and say that yes, we have to undermine the system, we have to question it constantly, and we have to create something from scratch maybe. And I would take the example from the art curators in African countries like Somali, for example, who do not look at what is happening in the Western world, but they create their own narratives, their own art history, the way that they want to talk about their history of art. And that could be a nice example. And I also would like to say that now in the museum institutions there is this tendency of, because the question of identity of artists is very sensitive, there is a tendency of avoiding any identities, and therefore we do not get information about the nationality, gender, race of an artist, which leaves us with really simple information that we receive, and there is a risk in that, in this tendency, because the narrative itself becomes really chaotic if there is any narrative at all, and we still have to acknowledge all the different identities of artists. And as I said in my presentation, what we are doing now is looking for the proper way to talk about this, but completely avoiding any mentions about identities to my opinion, would not be a solution.
So in my case, I will go back to the artistic situation, the artistic perspective. But not only, actually. I would like to go back to Edward Said. You spoke about him right now, and he was speaking about the Orientalism. He's known for his great research and book, Orientalism. So in our, I would say, put myself in our southern countries, like in the case of Tunisia and the Arab and Middle East and African countries, we went through the period that our history was written by the Western gaze on us. And even in our tentatives of what we are doing now of emancipation and taking over to write our own history, there is still the socle that is there, the first gaze on us. So even if we want to react, we will react upon something that is already there. And there is this back and forth, and there is already a different position from the Western view. There isn't an Oriental that wrote the history of the Westerners. So already there is a kind of disequilibrium. But we have an incredible chance today. I see it as an artist, and I feel like we're still missing it. So artists coming from the southern countries very often are in the process of engaging with their own communities back home, even if they are living in Europe or in America or whatever, and speaking about all of these injustices and colonial issues, etc. But what about giving a perspective about the Western countries in which we are living today, but from our gaze, from our African gaze or Arab gaze or Ukrainian gaze or whatever. So this is something that I'm really passionate and very interested about. Like the example that I did, what I did with Blitzstrom, we did before with Timo together in an exhibition in Bonn, at the Kunstmuseum Bonn, where we were looking at the modern history of Germany, but from my perspective, how I see it, so in relation to, from my African gaze, you see. And I was really afraid and worried how people would react with this, because it would be like a kind of intrusion. And I don't come, I live in the country, but I didn't live the Second World War in Germany. I heard about it from the perspective of my Ukrainian family and ancestors. So it's a completely different history. But talking about the German situation, but from my perspective, and actually what came out is that people were so open and happy about it, because I allowed a space that they didn't allow from themselves, for example, because of an incredible guilt. So I realized that the feeling of guilt that the Germans have, it's like a kind of a veil. It's not something that they're really deeply dealt with. It's like, I'm guilty, so okay, I don't have to look there, but I'm guilty, it's fine. So because I don't come from there, I was able to open, but with softness. Something that was there. And this softness and this openness was only possible because I'm not German. So speaking about these rewriting and perspective and colonial gaze, etc., what if we open it and we make it bring more porosity into it? Maybe this was possible for me because I don't belong to a place. But because I don't belong to a place, I truly belong everywhere. I feel the pain of the people with whom I speak to. There is an incredible deep empathy because of that porosity that is within me.
There are two things which I've encountered recently. The first was Roma Moma at Documenta, the last Documenta. And I don't know how many people had gone to that, but Roma Moma was part of the presentation by Rong Rupa and in the central Fredicinium space. What happened in Roma Moma was that one couldn't always locate the materials coherently within the Western museum system to say that this is what the provenance is. Some of those narratives were missing of the artists. What sort of became very interesting is that what Roma Moma did is that it asked other artists to evaluate the presence of that work in their lives. And this becomes what's known as inter-signatory, so that you have a relationship with a piece of work. In that relationship of making another piece of work that relates to that particular piece of work, even if that particular piece of work exists outside the provenance or location of museum memory, not people's memory. Yeah? People's memory is very different from museum memories. So the intersignatory process of evaluating a piece of work, which Roma Moma did, allowed us to understand the concept of the original work, the relationship to the original work, to the community of the Roma community. That was incredibly important, and 3 pieces of work, as far as I remember, one very large, took over a large amount of space, was devoted to this process of reevaluating something which was partially lost, and maybe it only existed in the memory of the people and not of the museum, because museums were not collecting this sort of work. It was work which was seen as outsiderism. So that's really an important process to think about how a very specific memory exists within the people and not in the institution. And we should not rely on institutional memory, on knowledge, which is what a lot of people are doing. The second thing is, I sat in a talk by Rolando Vasquez, who is a thinker and writer, who runs the Decolonial Summer School in Holland. 2 things he suggested which were very important. One, he said, Latin American nations have been decolonized or have had independence longer than most other nations in the world. So they've built up memory of decoloniality for a longer period of time. So they have ways and ideas which are ingrained within their societies, which they've been enacting on for a longer period than other nations. So their thinking should be evaluated as well for the duration of thinking that they've given to decoloniality. And one of the things that he came out with is that the system that we evaluate culture through is called aesthetics. Aesthetics is a form of representation and a form of display which is very European. It is part of, in a sense, what we call how we know something, how evidence is presented. So, for instance, aesthetics also dismisses a sphere of knowledge, a space where knowledge was created, where ideas were ordered or lined up. It orders them and lines up differently. So that's why we had the magician de la Terre, to reevaluate what this ordering was. So this space of ascription, which is epistemic, is also aesthetics. There's a group called, he came up with a term, let's just finish this, which is called aesthesis, which exists. Aesthesis, which is AESTHESIS, is an unelaborated, therefore not conforming to aesthetics, standardization. It's an elementary awareness of some stimulation. That intersignatory which I'm talking about, that Roma artist relaying to that piece of work, is a form of aesthesis, which they relate to it outside of aesthetics. Yeah? So outside of the provenance, outside of the epistemic reality that it creates for itself, yeah? Or has been created for it. So what, to a certain extent, Rolando Vasquez was saying is that we should talk about decoloniality or the decolonial as a form of aesthesis without the elaborate manipulation that's involved in aesthetics. And we should maybe turn, to a certain extent, to think about what we are already taking on board, because already, if we take something on board which is already developed, which is aesthetics, then we're taking on the colonial wound, and it will never heal. So without taking the very ways to measure things out of the way, if you don't take it out of the way, you're just applying that methodology back into the colonial wound, and it remains wounded. So these are ways, I think, which we need to think through problematics of, if you're interested in decoloniality and you're interested in not being, in a sense, re-entering it sideways or from the bottom up, that's what happens, that you're recreating colonial symmetry by using colonial tools. When you enter a museum, you trust it, but you can't trust a museum. You should never trust a museum. A museum is a hoarding place of every other culture's gifts, or every other culture's product. And we know that. The V&A is full of loot. The British Museum is full of war booty. None of it belongs there. It doesn't belong in Britain. It doesn't belong in that museum. So why trust it? How can you trust a museum if it's stolen most of the things it has? It's never, ever said anything about where it got it, how it got it, who it killed to get it. Museum is a place of massacre.
I'm very moved by many of the things that you said, but just coming back to the museum, I completely agree, but not any museum. So really all of these historical and... I agree. They have to prove otherwise, because also museum is Western heritage. This is how we have a contact to art, through distance, through display, so through vitrine. In different parts of the world, aesthetic and art is really part of your everyday life. It's part of how you pray, how you see your neighbor, how you sit on the floor, how you do everything. So it's two different worlds. The museum still has imposed itself in the universe, in the world, but it doesn't have to be the only way how you approach aesthetic and art. But just a question to you, you were speaking about aesthetics and aesthetics. Is it something like understanding versus feeling? Something like that?
Aesthetics takes on a greater amount of artwork, including the folkloric. It doesn't situate itself just in the fine arts, for instance. So it takes on women's work, for instance. It would take on what was known as native work. It would take on craft. It would reevaluate everything from the stimulation you get rather than the system that is applicable to it. So you don't go through it with the system of disciplines, which was talked about yesterday, where it's fine art, it's sculpture, it's printmaking, and then everything underneath it. Yeah, sort of. So it abolishes that. It says, this provides stimulation. And what sort of stimulation does it provide for you? And you elaborate on your feeling rather than the feeling which is imported onto it by somebody else who seems to think that they know historically what is right. And what is right is the dismissal of the rest from the West.
Yeah, thank you.
I would like to invite our audience to get into the conversation, and please, when you want to say something, you have a question or you want to share your thoughts, make a remark, just raise your hand and wait until you get the microphone, because the rest will not hear you. Any thoughts? Questions? Okay. Okay. Then we will have some time to have just some final remarks. And as this is the final event of the whole module of our 2 days work, I would like to ask you to share what would be your takeaways from these conversations that we had. What are the conclusions that you will have, and what will you bring into your practices from these 2 days of conversations and discussions and screenings? Maybe particular ideas, maybe particular plans, or just kind of general acknowledgements and general thoughts. Was it useful? Was it disappointing? Was it, I don't know, frustrating?
I'm next to you. So it's difficult to answer because it is still very fresh, so it is just happening within me right now, but definitely not disappointing. Absolutely fruitful. I was extremely moved by the film, the documentary film, of course. Well, first of all, seeing Kyiv, and like I really felt the extreme parallel with the work of wiping out in Blindstrom and in different parts of the world. What memory, how important it is, and how it is actually our fight. But it is very difficult to do it in artistic means, because I don't think that art should be political. Maybe some people will. No, at all. Even if this would seem very strange, because at first glance my work seemed very political. Actually, it isn't. It has a political content, but it doesn't want to convince. It doesn't want to bring any message, because once you do that, you become political. And I think art is more to open the space of questioning and the realm of the doubt and all of that. That's more our business. But seeing this film and being present here, I feel like this is my fight, definitely, but probably with other means, as a citizen of a world, citizen of Ukraine, as a person. And I really always try not to corrupt art through that sense, because if art is used for scientific means, mixed with a source of science or politics or activism, I feel as if it's like, as if art is not enough for itself, and we always have to use it or misuse it for something else. So fighting, absolutely, and this meeting here gives me so much power and really faith in what we can do together, and how important it is to communicate. Like Shaheen was saying, probably these things are happening because we don't communicate, but communicate also means just allow mourning, allow the suffering, allow the tears, and that the other, who probably was responsible for it, takes the time to look at it and feel it. That's also communicating. Sometimes communicating can happen in the silence, and it's much stronger then. But anyways, I don't know, it's just feelings now because it's very fresh. I just came today, and I can only say thank you very much. There's a lot inside of me happening.
We should stay here for 1 more hour and discuss either art needs to be political or not. But I would like to thank my colleagues for this discussion. I too need some time to reflect more on what's been heard, and thank you, Shaheen, for your insights during the keynote and the Roma Moma example that I will need to rethink, and it was very important for me to hear. And I also would like to say that from the whole module and from yesterday's discussions and keynote by Olena Chervonek, Tetyana already referred to this encyclopedia of Ukrainian art that's been published in the 60s, and this was, I've never heard about that before, and that was my big surprise to hear about this case. And thank you, Olena, for bringing this up and for making this research. And I think it is this bridge that unites us with the generation of 30s, and some cases from this encyclopedia is very important to research in the future.
I too want to thank Olena. Yesterday was fabulous. The screening was incredible. I think also when Olha talked about whose blindness or whose blind spot are we talking about, I think that was key in many ways. But what I'm also taking away is that we've got to be careful about not being nostalgic about certain struggles. We need to be really on top of it to understand what's going on around us without being sort of kind of galloping away in a direction which we can't get out of. We need to try to provide structures which can work for the next generation, because we're leaving a space which, how is attention to be received? How do we return certain things back to visibility? What is a process? And it is a process because, again, there'll be other edited realities that come in. There's this notion of presentism, which is I'm very aware of, is that we are looking at things from our present circumstances, and they were not necessarily conducted in our present circumstances. They were conducted in a very specific era for a specific recipient. And how do we support those artists who had that specificity without us acknowledging it differently and saying, oh, it matters to us about this and that, and it reads like this and that. So that whole notion of presentism is a whole different realm of untruth which could be introduced as well. So we have to be very careful, I think, in many ways, that what might work for I doesn't necessarily work for all. So power does corrupt at the end of the day. Thank you.
There is a question. Can we please have the microphone? The question or the remark, we don't know, but the raised hand is there, and we need a microphone, please.
Thank you. Well, it's not exactly a question, but maybe a remark, because I've been mentioned several times just now, and it's actually it is extremely pleasing that you guys think that my presentation was actually informative. But I've been actually thinking, so just now as you started talking and as you, Tanya, asked about, the kind of the sum up, like what are we getting from this whole 2 days of discussions, it just occurred to me that we're talking about how to bring into art history the things that were left out, but our discussion is often it's kind of revolving around the notion of art history as something static and something uncritical, as if it's like a given that we need to, it's a measuring stick that we need to apply to things that were not in the spotlight before. And I think it's a slightly dangerous way of thinking. And I think, Shaheen, you started talking about this, that art history or history of art is a particular type of knowledge that came out of a European paradigm, of European modern paradigm. It's not a type of knowledge that can encompass all the experiences in the world. It's it's a particular type of talking and thinking and methodologies and terminologies, and it definitely doesn't have a vocabulary sometimes to talk about the the experiences of the cultures that were not part of this European epistemic discourse. And so the question is, should we just try to fit in all these other cultures that were not under the art history umbrella before, or should we actually reconsider art history as a discipline in general and start thinking, is it a type of knowledge that we need to redefine or maybe even abandon? Because if you think historically, there were types of epistemic systems that are not functioning anymore. Like there used to be alchemy as a type of episteme, which is not here anymore. Like there used to be with philosophy, which is not here anymore. So we are constantly historically redefining the way we know the world. And so history of art is one of those kind of historic constructions. I'm not exactly sure if it fits all the other cultures, you know? And so maybe it's like too utopian or maybe too radical at the moment, but I would think that we will abandon art history as an epistemic system, and eventually we will come up with some other ways of knowing. Maybe this is the beginning of this path, and it's it's up to us to like actually start thinking: is history of art is actually useful in general for us? So that's kind of my summing up remark, and I think Fabio wants to add.
Sure, of course, yeah.
I think you, Olena, you have the power to tell better than me what I really think. So it's exactly what I was trying to say yesterday when, of course, I don't want to say that it's not the time to show hidden stories, hidden histories, but it's the time in which, unfortunately, we are not able to rethink a new system, a new general system, when we spoke yesterday about canon, for example. And this is the time. So let's try to take out, to remind all the hidden histories, but we shouldn't have now the hope or we shouldn't make an attempt in this moment to recreate a new system, because probably the new system will not work in a few years. So, and to put into the old system the new stories probably will also not work. So we are in a kind of archipelago of different situations that we have to accept like it is now.
But maybe we are changing the system and we're not really realizing, because what Olena is saying, how I feel it is that it is a process and we are in the middle of it. I don't think there was a moment when alchemy just ended from one day to the other. It just slowly was not necessary. Maybe we'll come back to it, who knows? But it's a utopian idea. But just to say that it is all flexible, and it seems a very radical position, Olena, what you were saying, but at the same time, it makes so much sense. The world is so much changing. We are rewriting history in every region of the world, and the West has to now acknowledge all of these things that are happening and to embrace it. And in this process, it will have to change. How it will change, we don't know, but I think it is happening.
Would you like to refer?
I may also thank Olena once again, because that's, what Olena was saying is exactly what I was trying to say when I was saying that we need to undermine the system of art and that we need to question it. And I too feel that we are this process had already begun. So it's not that we have to question either this will happen or not. It will change, and we just have to think about the ways to contribute to it.
Well, personally, I don't want to remain conflicted any longer than I have to. And if art history is seen to be a democratic process of analyzing what's going on in this earth, then we need to maybe think about what scholarship is doing at the moment. And I think scholarship at the moment is governing and looking at that process and making decisions about how much has been erased and how much remains erased. And I think that is the right of historians to think about what has remained refused or in the footnotes. If canonization, if it's anything, it is about the struggle to get into the canon, to abandon certain canons, to create a relationship and connections between the limits of the governance of what exists at the moment and what can be made of future scholarship. This is not normal. The history at the moment which we're speaking about And it's been proven by so many people over the last 2 days that it's an enormal reality which has been presented to us when there is evidence and facts that strikes well and should strike well to create and organize knowledge better. So if anything, I would just like to say that we need, if the emphasis at the moment is on the brutality of what has happened, it will lead to a certain extent to emerge later on, and I believe later on it'll emerge in a way that it is more about global art histories and modernisms, parallel modernisms, rather than a modernity.
I will allow myself also to share some thoughts, and I think that the one about the nature of art history in general that we referred to for the last 2 days is that we kind of see this art history as definitely a science born in the West, with the Western art being the center of it, the subject of it, and knowing the theory of knowledge, the paradigm of the Western science. This science has to have, it has a certain field, and it knows the limits of this field, and everything that is in this field is kind of recognized as existing. And something that falls out of that field is definitely something that's not existing anymore. So our struggle to kind of get into that art history is equals to our desire to exist, you know, to kind of be in history and stay there for as long as possible, for as long as someone is studying this history. And we definitely see the limits of this system, the system that was brought here by the ideology of modernism, or the view, the modernist view, which was based on the imperial approach and the imperial power. And we see the limit because it definitely doesn't fit all the stories as we see, because there is not enough language, there is not enough instrument to even understand how big our blind spot is, because the one who is looking at can just see very narrow paths, while the majority stays beyond it. So in this perspective of abandoning art history as a science that we came as a conclusion, I would like to again remember about decoloniality, and as the thinking, the way of thinking, the approach, and that decoloniality does not have this limit. So decoloniality never ends. I mean, we don't know, it is not a certain field that we have to kind of, you know, go around and that's it. You know, we have done the whole decolonial work. It never ends. It's the never-ending story, and this is also something that we refer to. And I would like to remind just a few words that Madina Tlastanova told also here on the stage in September, that no one owns decoloniality, but everyone has the right for decoloniality. You know, given it endless, kind of endless field, yeah, so like no limits to this process. So maybe if we want to really rethink the epistemology of art history, let's rename this discipline into art histories. So it's not single, but plural instead. Art histories as an approach to kind of, you know, give access to any stories enter this field, or abandoning the limits of this field and making like the whole space, the space of existence to all stories in the art. That would be my main takeaway. Something I will think about in the next weeks and in the next month, and something I will bring to this stage very shortly in November when we continue this discussion program. And the next module will be dedicated to biennials and decoloniality. something really practical, something very specific that you can really change in a very short time span, basically in 2 years, when there will be new Venice Biennial. We could already see the results. And in that future conversation that will happen here on the 18th and 19th of November, we'll invite people from different biennials, from Venice Biennial, from Manifesta, from Documenta, from Berlin Biennial, and other participants, stakeholders, artists, curators who participate in them. And we will continue this conversation on how the biennials can react, how can biennials change, because they are also kind of products of this Western paradigm, the same art history in singular art history. And we'll see how decoloniality allows us to see a wider perspective on the biennials, and that's their heritage. We will also refer to the history of Varvara and Bogdan Khanenko, whom I mentioned yesterday in my introductory speech, and we'll see more behind the pavilions, what is happening behind them, how they were actually created, what is the story behind their existence, the future, how they happen to be here, how the concept of this huge exhibition change the setting of the art world, how they change the principles, the rules, who actually creates these rules. So there's still a lot of work to do. Another outcome I will take with me, but definitely I feel very optimistic from all the conversations that we had in the last 2 days, because things can be changed and they are changing, and we could see examples from the past how they're changed, and it gives us confidence that we are able to make this change now, for tomorrow, for the future generations. And closing this event and closing the program for this particular module, I would like to thank again everyone, all the speakers, for your generous presentations and your contributions for these discussions. Thank you for the audience, for being with us, for being active and asking questions and sharing your thoughts. Thank you to the technical team, wonderful, who made it possible to be here in person and also online for all the other people who were not able to come. Thank you, La Biennale de Venezia, for hosting us and being a wonderful home for this program for many months. I would like to thank my colleagues from the Ukrainian Institute and Lesa Bullet in person, who helped bring all the people here and arrange the project. To my colleagues in the Ukrainian Pavilion team, curators Lisa Herman, Maria Lenko, and Boris Filonenko, for being someone who can always think with me on this program. And the Renaissance International Renaissance Foundation for supporting this particular model. Thank you, everyone. Please stay safe. I would like to thank also the Ukrainian armed forces, Ukrainian volunteers, Ukrainian government, Ukrainian everyone for holding the sky for us, for allowing us to have the pleasure and the possibility to have this conversation of, distant topics, philosophical issues, while they are protecting the peace with the land, not the peace, but the land with their lives. Thank you, everyone. We'll see each other in November. Please share the link to the recording, as everything that we were talking about in these past 2 days will stay online for as long as online exists. Share and stay safe, and Slava Ukraini.